Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, Broadway, showbiz stories, news and gossip, with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today's topic is Billy Wilder. And now, here's Steve, Arthur, and Julian.
Guys, I got to tell you, I was preparing for the podcast today. I had the news on in the background, and they're talking about a guy in Turkey who's stuck in a mine shaft. And everybody's gathering all of their energies to get this guy out of the mine shaft. And I thought it was very ironic that we're doing Billy Wilder Day on Tales from Hollywoodland. And one of the most cynical, if not the most cynical, of Billy Wilder's directing credits and writing credits is a movie that was originally called Ace in the Hole.
Horrific film, way ahead of its time. They were so afraid of it that they renamed it The Big Carnival, right, starring Kirk Douglas at his most aggressive, most tough, unrelenting character. But there's something so interesting about him, and it's so ahead of the whole tabloid thing that we have seen now. It's like prescient. He actually, well, you just said it, Steve. Turkey, it just happened, but we've also seen that in a movie like Facing the Crowd, where these guys like Kazan, Bud Schulberg, they're predicting what's going to happen 20, 30, 40, and 50 years later.
Or Network.
And Network, that's right.
Well, for the listeners who have not seen Ace in the Hole, like what I just mentioned about this miner down in Turkey, the story is about a man who gets trapped in a mine shaft. And Kirk Douglas is a very cynical reporter who sees an opportunity to get back to the New York journalism world. This takes place in a small desert community. There's nothing going on here until the whole media world descends on this small town. And Kirk Douglas, to keep the story going, does some terribly unconscionable things to make the story bigger than it is. And the reason they changed the title to The Big Carnival was because literally there's so much energy in this town. A carnival comes to town selling popcorn and cotton candy while they're trying to rescue this poor sod.
Well, it was a brilliant movie. And I want to say that in my meeting with Billy Wilder, I asked him if it were possible to remake Some Like It Hot. And he said, no, it's not because, in his accent, of course, no, it's not because it was a perfect movie. He said the movie to remake is Ace in the Hole. That was a great movie that nobody went to see. And unbelievable, but it just didn't do anything at the box office. But it's one of his greatest films.
I interviewed Jan Sterling, who played the miner's wife in the thing, and she was very interesting, talking about how the film was. They knew even while they were shooting it that this was going to be trouble. That this was not going to be an easy movie. She has one of the best lines in any Billy Wilder movie, and it turns out it came from his wife Audrey. But they asked Jan Sterling, "It's Sunday, aren't you going to church?" And she says, "I never go to church because kneeling bags my stockings."
Billy Wilder stuff.
You know, we're talking about a director, and, you know, back in the 50s, Billy was the crown prince of a very special group of directors. And I was thinking about contemporary directors. Very few directors get known today. Yes, Steven Spielberg gets known. Yes, James Cameron gets known. Quentin Tarantino, Christopher Nolan. That's 4 out of 2,000 directors. And, you know, it's interesting. I think that the run Billy had from the late 40s or middle 40s when he did Double Indemnity, all the way through to 1, 2, 3 in the early 60s, that 20-year run of success with a few bombs, but mostly amazing successes, 7 Academy Awards for writing and directing, has not been equaled. I don't think anybody's had that kind of run. What do you guys think?
Well, maybe Hitchcock on our show, we talked about a lot of his incredible, but not too many people. You're right. But we have to say that Billy Wilder started in silent movies. He didn't start. I mean, he started directing in talkies, but he was writing. Of course, when you wrote for silent movies, the average script was 25 pages. Now, its average script is 95 pages, almost 4 times that. But he had a reason for that cynicism. He had a reason for a lot of darkness. His mother was killed in a concentration camp. His grandmother was killed in a concentration camp. He had a tough early life, and he was able to become a huge success. He probably did it like Hitchcock, 50, 60 movies, didn't he, Arthur?
He did. It was really a number of films, the quantity, but the quality of these things. There were so many gems. I think that, first of all, there was a great piece on TCM they did on the directors and the filmmakers who came over from Germany just as Hitler was getting in. One of them was Billy Wilder. He left Germany on a train for Paris, and from Paris he went to Hollywood. But Billy Wilder couldn't even speak English when he arrived here, and lived with Peter Lorre, an old friend, while he was, trying to start out. One of the things that Wilder said was that they, during the Weimar Republic, when things were pretty hip in Berlin, and things were happening like in Cabaret, as it was depicted, that everybody, he included, felt that Hitler was like a joke. They didn't, he lost the election. He had a minority, obviously, and yet he got in. And there were people saying, in 6 months he'll be gone. He's a joke. It's a clown. Well, as soon as Wilder sensed what was happening in reality, he got out of there in 1933. Billy Wilder, in my opinion, for whatever it is worth, is the greatest film director ever. And because he had more masterworks than anyone. So if we put it into perspective of saying, well, today's greatest baseball players are, and then you say, well, how are they in respect to, let's say, Willie Mays? Well, I saw Willie Mays, and Willie Mays is still the greatest player of all time to me, as he is to most people who saw him. Billy Wilder, to think about Billy Wilder, I think we need to talk a bit about Spielberg, who had several masterworks without question. James Cameron, these awesome movies that he's made that are just big box office. And to understand just how great Wilder was with story-driven movies is, I would think of Schindler's List today as for what Spielberg did. And there are so many different directors who had 1 or 2 or maybe 3. David Lean made epic masterworks in Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, and Bridge of the Quai. So I think we need to understand just how big Spielberg is, how great he's been. His E.T.s were a commercial E.T., Jaws, master works of commercial filmmaking. Wilder's films, which were all story-driven, there were several movies of his that did big box office. As an example, Some Like It Hot, put into today's money, based upon the admissions of those days, would have done $359 million today.
It's interesting. It's interesting also, Arthur, that these directors weren't working on franchise pictures back then. I mean, Spielberg certainly created the Raiders of the Lost Ark franchise. He's done multiple episodes of that franchise. But the thing about Billy that's so startlingly great is how many original pieces he brought to the marketplace. These were not, this wasn't Poltergeist 3 and Iron Man 7. These were all originals. I think it's also important to note that Billy Wilder, originally from Hungary, he had no family. His parents were, I think they sold tea and magazines at the railroad station. His older brother was an budding filmmaker, and this was just the very, very beginning of the film industry. This is the 1911, 1912 in Budapest. And Billy waded into this and got very excited about it. Actually, he started out as an actor and realized fairly soon that he could never achieve the levels that he thought would be a successful actor. So one of the things he did is he went to Norway and got involved with a company called I think Nordisk or something like that. And he learned filmmaking techniques in Norway, in a country where he didn't speak the language, which is similar to what happened when he came to America, because his English was very limited, if non-existent. But he definitely studied his craft, and his storytelling ability is just off the charts. Julian, do you have a favorite Billy Wilder movie?
Well, we talked about Ace in the Hole. That's one of my favorites. But the favorite for me is Double Indemnity. I just think that is so special. An incredible. Nobody wanted to take the male lead. He even got turned down by George Raft, who, of course, didn't know what the hell he was doing because he couldn't even read a script, and turned down Casablanca. I mean, George Raft had a lot that he was turning down. But so Fred MacMurray didn't want to do it. No one wanted to play, no movie star in those days wanted to play a murderer of any sort, but he convinced him to do it.
I mean, Fred MacMurray was just an easygoing, nice guy on screen. You know, he was a basic good guy. It's just funny because
making comedies, light
it's
comedies.
Funny because not only did Billy get him for Double Indemnity, but 16 years later, he gets him for The Apartment to play Sheldrake, the womanizing head of the company.
Yeah. That he was not the first choice. And the Apartment, the man who was going to be the boss was Paul Douglas, who happened to be married to Jan Sterling. We talked about her.
Right.
Paul Douglas, literally a couple of days before he was going to shoot, dies. And Billy runs to Fred after all those years. And Fred says, wait a second, I'm working for Disney now. I can't do this movie. I can't play a philanderer. But Billy once again prevails.
And then brought him back in Apartment. And he was also that kind of a guy. He wasn't a killer, but he was that kind of a guy. I want to come back for a second to take a look at Marty Scorsese, who clearly is a master director. Raging Bull,
no question.
Casino, Goodfellas. What am I missing, guys? For the really great stuff. Don't say Mean Streets, but what am I missing?
Well, his Oscar-winning Best Picture of the Year with Leonardo DiCaprio and
Departed?
The Departed. Yeah, that was a huge thing. Absolutely. You know, Scorsese is also a huge film buff like Spielberg. So they really know how to generate original material. Absolutely.
And remember that Wilder was also writing a lot of these things.
Oh no, of course.
I want to come back for a second. So take the Scorsese example, the Spielberg example of Schindler's List, and what else in terms? Forget the huge box office movies. Empire of the Sun. Would anybody say that would be a great work of his?
No, and no way. But let's try to, if we can, stick with Billy. If we can.
I'm sticking with it. I'm trying to put it into perspective. So now let's go back to Billy Wilder and just start from the beginning. He makes Bad Seed as his first movie in 1934. Makes The Major and the Minor, a nice movie. Makes Five Graves to Cairo, a very good movie. And then in 1944, he makes what Julian was talking about. He makes a masterwork, Double Indemnity. Then goes back next and makes The Lost Weekend, a masterwork.
Let me stop you just for a second about Double Indemnity. First of all, the general feeling about James Cain's novel was that under the code, it was unfilmable. There was no way that not only did Fred MacMurray not want to play the role, but nobody figured nobody would play the role because they would never get by the code. But the thing was, he teamed up to write the screenplay with Raymond Chandler, who we all know as the great mystery novelist. And apparently they did not get along at all. They were like two bulls in a china shop. And apparently Billy was a rather cavalier figure with the ladies. You know, he was always going, I don't know if he was married at the time, but he certainly was going out with a lot of women, and he was throwing it in Raymond Chandler's face. In the meantime, Raymond Chandler is an alcoholic. The whole idea of putting this together which in Hollywood terms sometimes creates masterpieces, like Arthur said. I mean, you put together two guys who are totally different, and you create a masterwork.
Let's come back to what I'm talking here about, which is take a guy like Scorsese, and you mentioned 3 or 4 pictures that are really masterpieces of the great work that he's done. And I think he probably would agree with everything we're talking about here. But let's keep going with Billy Wilder and watch what happens. So he goes from Lost Weekend, which was a masterpiece for what it was, and Double Indemnity, and then he makes a picture called Foreign Affair, good movie. Then he makes another masterwork called Sunset Boulevard. And then he makes Ace in the Hole, another one. And then he makes Stalag 17, another one. Sabrina, good film. 7-Year Itch, good film. Spirit of St. Louis, okay. Love in the Afternoon, okay. Witness for the Prosecution, another one. Some Like It Hot, another one. The Apartment, another one. This guy was a freak. He was certainly the most eclectic great director of all time, and may very well have been the greatest director of all time. All these things were story-driven, tough pictures to create.
I think the first time I really saw a Billy Wilder film was very out of sorts for me, because I was 8 and I went to see The Apartment with my parents. And The Apartment in 1960 was a huge, huge film. I mean, I was more interested in going to see The Alamo from John Wayne down the street, but my parents wanted to see what they considered to be adult entertainment. And being an only child, I often went with them to see adult entertainment. And we're not talking about porno. We're just talking about non-Saturday afternoon whiz-bang movies. And years later, when I started to tape the entire movie on audio tape, just to play to help me go to bed at night, that was a little hobby that I've had for years. Now I just play them while I'm shaving. I listened to the soundtrack of The Apartment over and over again. There were things that Billy did with his movies that I just loved. He loved opening a movie with narration. There was some of his better movies start just setting the stage with narration. And of course,
Steve, who was the voiceover in Stalag 17?
That was Gil Stratton, who later became a very famous newscaster in LA sports. He was a
guy, right?
Sportscaster. But the
Steve, if I can just jump in here for a second.
Jump in, please.
On what you just said. A lot of people have no idea that Sunset Boulevard did not start initially with William Holden. It started in a morgue with bodies with sheets over them, and they were telling their stories of how they died. One guy, then a kid, and then Bill Holden. And they screened it a couple of times, and it just didn't work. So Billy, very smartly, took out the first 2 deaths and started with William Holden.
In the pool.
And the second thing about that, and then I'll go right back to you, I promise, is that originally, I don't know if you guys know who was going to be the Bill Holden role. It wasn't going to be Bill Holden.
Oh, no, I know that Billy wanted Montgomery Clift.
And Billy got Montgomery Clift. And Montgomery Clift, 3 days before shooting, said, I'm not doing it. And one of the reasons he wasn't doing it was he was obviously a bisexual fellow. And at the time when he was with a lady who was many more years older than him. So he was afraid that it would mirror too much of what his life had been.
Do we know who that woman was?
Libby Holman.
Libby Holman.
Oh, so anyhow, back to you, Steve Areno.
Well, I just love the way he plays around with narration. I mean, The Apartment starts with Jack Lemmon's voice. He says, on November 1st, 1959, the population of New York City was 8,233,825. If you laid all these people end to end, figuring an average height of 5'6.5" they'd stretch from the Times Square to Karachi, Pakistan. I know facts like this because I work for an insurance company, Consolidated Life. I mean, you immediately get the you get this, and all of his, not all of his movies, but certainly Sunset Boulevard starts with William Holden as the police cars are arriving at the home of Norma Desmond. You hear him talking about it's 5:00 in the morning, and this is the homicide squad. And I've always loved narration if it's done with a clever touch. One of my favorite ones of his is the opening to The 7-Year Itch. Do you remember how that begins?
Yes.
I don't know.
I do.
Starts
go
out
ahead, Steve. It's great. Go ahead.
An Indian village. And you say that 500 years ago, the Manhattan Indians were known for a peculiar ritual. In the hot summertime, they would send their wives and children up country to the cool lands while they stayed in their village and hunt and fished and track game. And then Billy has a very statuesque brunette with Indian braids walk across the screen, and about 11 Indian braids like chasing after her. Yeah. So then he says, which I love, he says, of course, our story has absolutely nothing to do with Indians. It begins 500 years later, and you hear the sound of the Grand Central Station, but nothing has changed. Manhattan husbands still send their wives and children to the North Country for the cool weather, while they stay in town hunting, fishing, and setting traps. So now we're about to meet a typical family, and that's when we meet Tom Ewell. I just love the way he sets up stories like that, and
also his casting was impeccable, and Tom Ewell was the perfect schmuck to play opposite.
Arthur, you're going to be shocked to know that Tom Ewell was not his choice. He did not want Tom Ewell.
Who was it? Who was the choice?
It's going to be. He came to New York, tested a guy who was pretty good on stage, hadn't made a movie, or if he did, it was one only, and he was nobody. And his name was Walter Matthau.
Oh, really?
And that's who he wanted. He wanted Walter Matthau. But the studio, et cetera, actually, I think it was Charlie Feldman, the famous agent producer, who convinced him to go with Tom Ewell.
Well, but the fact of the matter is that in the casting process, there are these kind of stories for almost every movie. Who was number one on the list, number two, and number 7 got it and turned out. But the outcome is that Tom Ewell was in it, and Tom Ewell was a perfect schmuck. Play opposite, huh?
I'm just, Arthur, excuse me, Julian, wasn't Tom Ewell from the Broadway play?
Yes, he was. He was in the play and had done a wonderful job. Walter certainly Tom Ewell we'd never call a handsome leading man. But Walter, in those days, while he certainly wasn't Cary Grant, was a very attractive man. If you look him up in the 50s, what we're talking about, he was an attractive guy, and it might have been a little more sexy on the male side, even though, as Arthur just said, Tom Ewell was perfect as we would call in the Bronx a putz.
And Marilyn Monroe never really looked better. She looked. I mean, she didn't eclipse anything, but she looked so great in almost everything she did. But she never looked better than in 7-Year Itch.
Well, apparently the night that she does the subway grading scene, which of course is probably one of the most iconic moments in comedy movie history, the story goes Joe DiMaggio was on the set that night and was very, very upset about the whole sequence.
He left in a huff.
I wonder why.
He left the set, yeah. Also, there was a huge fight with all the stagehands and the guys on the crew who all wanted to be underneath the ventilator.
Yeah. So getting back to you said you saw the apartment when you were 8. I was less than 10 when my friends and I, as I've said before, paraded off to go to the movies on Saturday because we didn't know what was playing. And on top of the chapter and the news and the cartoons and everything else was a little movie called The Lost Weekend. And here we are all minus 10 years old with no ratings code. And that movie terrified us from the point of view of kids who were 8 or 9 years old. But Lost Weekend, have seen it any number of times since, is an incredible movie. Ray Milland doesn't get better. Again, perfection. You would all agree that was a masterpiece?
And I don't know about a masterpiece, but I certainly agree. Number one, it was courageous to make a movie about alcoholism. No one had done that. There was no Days of Wine and Roses or anything like that when he made it. That was the thing. Irma La Douce is about prostitution. Who does these things? Billy Wilder took on what almost no one would do in the 50s, as you guys have said, in incredible things.
Irma La Douce was top 3 in his box office, I believe, Julian, headed by Some Like It Hot, of course. But Irma La Douce is a big success. Lou Jacoby, the bartender, how great was he?
On The Lost Weekend, Billy won 3 Oscars that night. He won Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Writer with Charles Brackett. So that was a big haul for Billy. And I guess the awards people love Billy Wilder. He had so many.
He was great.
Yeah.
He was Willie Mays. He was Tiger Woods.
He was Willie Mays.
He did have trouble with the award people when he was nominated for Best Picture and Best Director and Best Screenplay for Double Indemnity, which had 7 nominations. He lost all of them, every one. And what do you think won? Going My Way with Liam McCarey directing. So this is absolutely a true story. And when I say that, because I had to check it out because I couldn't believe it. Because Billy is one tough character, as we will absolutely discuss. He's sitting there near Leo McCarey. Leo McCarey gets up to get the award. He sticks his foot out. And Leo McCarey literally trips and falls down on his way. Now, you could call that a sore loser. I think that's the definition of a sore loser.
Well, at least, Julian, he didn't slap him.
That's right. That's right.
How great a movie was a play that really shouldn't have been that big a box office hit called Witness for the Prosecution. That's a gem.
Big win. Big win.
It was a terrific, and his favorite actor, he said, of all time was Charles Laughton. He thought he was the greatest actor. He loved him. In fact, if you look at that movie, he puts his close-ups on Charles Laughton, and almost every other scene has other people in it. But when Laughton speaks, he gets the close-up.
Yeah, not a non sequitur. A lot of guys out in L.A., Julian, Steve, and Mike, when you talk about the great movie actors, there aren't that many that they bring up, but Edward G. Robinson is an example. One. Every one of them brings up Charles Laughton, and another one, which is kind of surprising a little, Frederick March's name comes up all over the place as a great movie actor. Paul Muni, great actor. Charles Laughton was a great actor.
Billy seemed to have the ability to cast actors not traditionally known for the genres they were working in. Fred McMurray, known for lighthearted fare. Edward G. Robinson did gangster movies. The supposedly Double Indemnity, 1944, ushers in the whole world of film noir, black and white with interesting lighting, and of course, even more so in Sunset Boulevard.
Edward G. Robinson in Double Indemnity, it ain't ever going to get better than what he was in that picture.
It is such a fantastic performance. And that little man, I've used that myself in life. The little man tells you better be careful. Something's off here. Something's going wrong. You mentioned, Steve, that he roomed with Peter Lorre. And of course, Peter Lorre became famous for Fritz Lang's M. But Billy said that he used the lighting. That was his idea, to use the lighting that Lang had used in M for Double Indemnity. I found that very interesting. Did you know that, Arthur?
No, I didn't. I do know that he got away with something in that picture that is somewhat unusual, and that is Barbara Stanwyck's blonde wig, which at first glance you kind of know it's a wig, but then you don't care because she's so great. She's great. Everybody in that movie is great. But the blonde wig, I would have thought, would have caught his eye, and he might have done a little bit better.
Well, he admitted, I think 6 days into production, he admitted that it had been a mistake. And I think they realized it was too late to change it, and they went with it.
The biggest mistake in Double Indemnity? It's really a big one, too. But no one notices it. Barbara Stanwyck is going to go visit Fred McMurray. And in his apartment, is Edward G. Robinson. So she comes in and she gets to the door and she hears them talking. So she stands to the side of the door and the door opens up, but no apartment door in history opens up onto the lobby, onto the hall. But this one does, so she can hide behind it. And Billy said when he realized it later, he just said, "Oh, I can't. I don't care. I'm just going to let it go."
And it worked, right?
It worked.
What a
You're
scene
right,
that
Arthur.
was. How about the tension in that scene was amazing. Underrated movie of Billy Wilder's was 1, 2, 3. Terrific movie. Cagney, never better for what he was doing. Do you guys agree?
Well, the staccato pace of the dialogue in that movie with Jimmy Cagney as the Coca-Cola executive in Berlin, blurting out his orders to everybody is just so funny. And the premise was so funny. Horst Buchholz, who had just scored by playing Chico in the original Magnificent Seven that John Sturges had directed, he wins the part of the East German kid who falls in love with the head of Coca-Cola's daughter. And they've got to turn him. It's kind of a little bit of a My Fair Lady premise, because they've got to turn this rebel from East Germany, he's a communist, into this proper gentleman. And it was just, Cagney, you're right, was so wonderful in that role.
Steve, you're so great with these lines from the movies. So I'm going to throw one at you. Let's see if you can get it in 3 seconds. You ready? What's the last line in Stalag 17?
Go ahead, Steve. You've been rehearsed on this one.
The last line in Stalag 17 is Animal. The Robert Strauss character says, "I bet you he just wanted to steal our wire cutters."
That's right.
And then we cut to Gil Stratton whistling when Johnny comes marching home. Do you know that William Holden also was not the first choice to play Sefton? Having worked with Kirk Douglas on Ace in the Hole, Billy wanted Kirk Douglas to play Sefton. And I guess Kirk Douglas went to see the play, which was playing on Broadway. The Stalag 17 was written by 2 ex-prisoners of war. So there was a kind of an interesting feeling about the unique. No one had ever done a story about prisoners, even though in reading the play today, it's very creaky. It's not exactly the most simple. They completely rewrote the play for the movie. I mean,
wasn't Otto Preminger fantastic in that?
Otto Preminger was unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, Arthur, it's really your turn now. You are the only one of the 4 of us that spent time with Bill Holden. So tell us a little bit about it. I interviewed him, but not the way you experienced.
Well, it's hard to tell that whole story. It's in a book that I'm writing now, that whole story. But that story takes place really because Harry Cohn, who was the studio head, of course, and owned Columbia Pictures, came into town when I was the executive page at Columbia Pictures in New York. And by then, part of my job was to escort various people into the executive offices of all of the companies in those days were run in New York. The filming and production was out in L.A. But every film company was run out of New York City. So I was at Columbia as a kid, 17 years old, executive page, serving drinks and what have you at screenings and all that. But I got to see, I can't tell you how many different movie stars came up. When they were in town, they'd always come and visit with Abe Schneider or Leo Jaffe. Or when Harry Cohn came into town, they'd all come by, and I would, of course, escort them in. And I became slightly jaded, even at that age. I've seen so many people. I got stuck in an elevator with Richard Conte, who had rosary beads out. He was claustrophobic. I mean, I was stars all over the place. Judy Holliday, you name it, they were there. And I was, Dino De Laurentiis. You got a light for a cigarette, kid? You got a light for a cigarette? That was Dino. 35 years later, I'm at a party in L.A. You got a light for a cigarette, kid? It was Dino De Laurentiis again. So everybody and anybody was there. And one day when I was a bit jaded, I thought I saw everybody. The elevator doors opened up, and here came Bill Holden. And that was during the time of Bridge on the River Kwai. And he came off that elevator, and I remembered everything about that meeting wearing a black mohair suit, a soft yellow shirt, a black tie with some red dots, sunglasses, tanned, and the man walked. It was like unbelievable. He was the greatest looking person I've ever seen.
Well, if you want to save the rest for the book, that's up to you.
Yeah, almost have to. I'll just briefly say that his meeting was with Harry Cohn. I took him into Harry Cohn's office, and his secretary, "Oh, Mr. Holden, how are you?" And of course, the door opens up, and Harry Cohn welcomed Bill Holden with every curse word in the book. There were no U's, there was nothing in between. It was just dirty words. And Holden said, "Good to see you're in good spirits, Harry." And the door closed. So the rest of the story, I really probably prefer not to tell, but the rest of the story simply is that he was in there for like 8 hours. And I got a call from the receptionist, said, "They're calling you. Mr. Cohn wants to see you." And I'm thinking, Mr. Cohn wants to see me? You're kidding. So in I go, and the secretary named Molly says, "Good luck." And I opened the door, and there was Bill Holden laying on the floor, totally drunk. And his tie was off, and it was a mess. And the whole idea of it is that Harry Cohn, who was sitting there with his feet up on the desk, no shoes, in his socks, his teeth were on the desk. They were both completely drunk. And Bill Holden was singing Danny Boy. And
what a scene.
Harry Cohn said, "Put this piece of shit together and get him back to the Sherry Netherland Hotel," which is 5 blocks down on Fifth Avenue. And it was my job to do that. And I had to put him together and get him up. And Harry Cohn gave me $10 to get a cab and take him to the Sherry Netherland, which was like a minute or so away. And I got Holden down. I got Bill Holden down the elevator. I had my arm around him, but he was completely drunk. And I got to the foyer of 711 Fifth Avenue. It was a marble wall, and I had to put him up against the wall. It's kind of like if you saw the movie My Favorite Year, similar in a sense to what happened with Peter O'Toole. But I put him up against the wall. I said, "Mr. Holden, Mr. Holmburn." I was so flabbergasted, I couldn't even say his name. "Please stay here. I got to get a cab." And in those days, for some reason, there was no limousine for a Bill Holden. Today, there would be a limousine for any movie star. But you would all agree that in 1957, Bill Holden was as famous as Tom Cruise today or whoever it was. He was famous. So he said, "I don't want to take a cab. Let's walk. I'll be okay if I walk." "Mr. Holmberg, you can't walk. You got to take a cab," Mr. Cohn said. And fuck it. And it was one of those things. So he said, "Just walk with me, hold me up, and I'll be okay." And so I'm holding Bill Holden up on Fifth Avenue. It's May. It's a beautiful 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And there's millions of people on Fifth Avenue. And I'm holding William Holden up. And as I'm walking, someone screams out, "It's Burt Lancaster." And it's Kirk Douglas. It's William Holden. And he's kind of drunk. And by the time we got to Tiffany's on 57th Street, he was less drunk and said, I can walk now. And so he did. The Fifth Avenue parted like the Red Sea for William Holden. The rest of the story is I'm saving for the book, but that's the essence of it. And to say the least, he was an impressive guy. I mean, he walked. The way he walked was fantastic.
Well, 2 years earlier, my mother went to see him in Love. Love is a Many Splendored Thing with Jennifer Jones. And my mother was just the biggest movie buff ever. And of course, I get a lot of that from her. And she talked about that forever. And between that and Three Coins in the Fountain, which I think was about the same time, those romantic movies, which have somewhat disappeared from the movie marketplace.
But Steve, your mom was right. Love is a Many Splendid Thing is one of the greatest movies of its time.
Right.
Stands up today. If just buy into it, you got to buy into it. That love story, the music. Your mom was right. I understand exactly what she's talking about.
I mean, Holden was the ultimate matinee idol of the 1950s. He carried on the tradition of Cary Grant and it's interesting today, if you think about actors like Bill Holden, who are actors that men really like them and women go nuts for them. I think the only person I can think of is George Clooney, who has a following.
Well, but we had Paul
Matt
Newman,
Damon.
we had Robert Redford, and we had
Matt Damon.
Well, I'm talking, Julian. I'm talking about this moment today.
Yeah,
We've got a lot
Matt
of
Damon.
action.
How about Brad Pitt? Would you say?
Brad Pitt's probably as close as we can get. Yeah.
I want to say something about Bill Holden, if I can. We talked about Barbara Stanwyck, but not much about Double Indemnity. Let's start out by saying Billy wanted her from the beginning. She read it. She wanted to do it from the beginning. But when I interviewed Bill Holden on my radio show, he went crazy for Barbara Stanwyck because it was his first movie, Golden Boy, and she was his protector. She taught him, he said, how to act. She took him under her wing. I don't know if there was romance. Like, she may have been married at that time to Robert Taylor, so she knew how to get a handsome guy. So I don't know that, but he was so enamored of her, as was Wilder. I gather she was quite a woman. Did any of you ever meet her? I never did.
Stanwyck? No.
But, no.
Back to Billy Wilder and Stan. How about, forget Stanwyck, how about Billy Wilder and Bill Holden? We haven't talked about Sabrina. Terrific movie.
Yeah, that's true. And he did not, you know who he wanted for the Bogart role? Because he couldn't stand Bogart, by the way. He couldn't stand him. And Bogart couldn't stand him. They really didn't get along well. But his original choice was always Cary Grant for almost everything he did.
I read that.
And they were friends. They were good friends. Yeah. But he could never get Cary Grant. He wanted him for Love in the Afternoon. And as great as Gary Cooper is, I think it would have been a better movie with Cary Grant.
Yes. Cary Grant would have been a little miscast, I think, in Sabrina, because I think of the Bogey's character, Linus Larrabee, is kind of a little bit of an odd peg, not a romantic figure at all. He's so caught up in business.
But it wasn't supposed to be. That was changed when he got Bogart. It changed.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
The script changed.
Do we all remember Jack Webb in Sunset Boulevard?
Oh, sure, of course.
Did he want the facts then too? Just the facts?
He was good.
You know, when I interviewed Nancy Olson for my other podcast, we talked about the scene in Sunset Boulevard where Bill Holden and Nancy Olson are writing the script. They're working nights to create the screenplay, and they have a romantic moment where he finally kisses her and kisses her and kisses her. And apparently Mrs. Holden was on the set that night, and instead of Billy Wilder yelling cut, it was Mrs. Holden.
That's right. It's a great story. Steve, let's put you back. Let's put Steve back to work for a second. Edward G. Robinson dialogue in that scene that he apparently did in one take in Double Indemnity when he's explaining why you can't commit suicide falling off a train. You know that dialogue?
I see. You've cut me to the quick here because that is not one of my studied films, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I can tell you the opening of Stalag 17 though. Gil Stratton.
Yeah, go ahead.
It always makes me sore when I hear about those war pictures, all about flying leathernecks and American guerrillas in the Philippines and submarines. But there's never been a picture about prisoners of war. Now, my name's Clarence Harvey Cook. They call me Cookie for short. I was shot down over Magdeburg, Germany in 1943. And I ended up in Stalag 17. Stalag is the German word for prison camp. And
well, you know,
he's
Steve,
great.
honestly,
Julian,
he never ceases to amaze me, Arthur.
You gotta love it.
You're talking about a guy.
He sings too. Wait a minute, he sings too. You're
talking about a guy who used to go to sleep listening to these movies over and over again.
We've established that now. It's amazing. I do want to point out that, as I said about the beginning of Sunset Boulevard, the ending of Double Indemnity was not the ending that he originally shot. He shot the gas chamber. He shot the gas chamber.
Oh, wow.
Edward G. goes there. Fred is in the chair. I mean, it's all happening.
What an ending, though, Julian. What an ending. What an ending of a movie. Wow.
And he decided, whoa, I think it's better the way the scene before is.
He lights the cigarette. Yeah, wow.
That's right. And so it was very interesting because Billy Wilder, unlike a lot of the directors we talk about, would shoot his movies, almost all of them, 45, 50, the most 60 days. He didn't go into 20 weeks, 18 weeks, 16 weeks. But even doing that, even being at least a co-writer, he still had to, at times, as I said earlier, sunset beginning, change, and the ending of Double Indemnity. But what, as Arthur said, he was one of the greats.
Just not only that, but he was, remember now, he's writing these things as well as directing them.
Oh, sure. Now, here's something interesting. Today we have a term called dramedy, a dramatic comedy or a comedy drama, however it is. Billy Wilder, I think, was one of the first filmmakers, and I think this was pointed out by Jack Lemmon in one of his commentary tracks, because they were talking about The Apartment, that he would go back and forth from very dramatic moments to almost farcical moments. And the classic example of this is when Shirley MacLaine, who's been using Jack Lemmon's apartment with Fred McMurray, because they use his apartment for their assignations, she decides to commit suicide. And so she's lying in bed when he comes home with this ditzy blonde on New Year's Eve. And she's, they're smooching it up, and he walks into his bedroom and he sees the sleeping form of Miss Kubelik, obviously the Shirley MacLaine character. And it goes from very farcical comedy to this heavy drama, back and forth. And he's done that on several occasions, because even Stalag 17, it has a lot of funny moments, also has some very heavy dramatic moments. In fact, my favorite scene in Stalag 17 is when they finally find out who the informer is, and Holden confronts it.
Did you know, all of us who've seen the movie, did we know that it was Peter Graves? Did we think it was, or who did we think that it was?
I sure didn't.
Neither did I.
Not until Sergeant Schultz, played by Zig Roman, says, "Ach so."
Yeah, right.
So.
But how about the lighting on that light bulb swinging from left to right, and Holden is laying in the bed and sees this and gets to understand that that's where they're delivering the messages. One fast thing on Holden. I was having lunch with Terry Moore one day about 20 years ago, and we were going over to the Cafe Roma, talk something having to do with some business. This is older actress Terry Moore, who still was looking good at that time. So she spots two of her friends there, and we joined them. That would be Barbara Bach and Nancy Olson. And so I'm having lunch with these three beautiful women, and gets to talking about who was the best looking movie star that ever lived, the male movie star. And so they looked at me and I said, well, and it's Bill Holden to me. I don't tell them the story, but here's Bill Holden. And Barbara Bach says, I would agree with that. And Nancy Olson says, absolutely. There was nobody better looking than Bill Holden. And Terry Moore said, trust me, everybody, it was Tyrone Power. Just trust me. Okay? So just want to throw that in. That's all.
Tyrone Power, the star of Witness for the Prosecution, who in the LA airport in 1955, my first trip out from Chicago to LA, he walks up to me, lifts me up in his arms. I'm like 4 years old, and made my father very jealous.
And you didn't even know you were being lifted by a movie star.
I have, but my mother told me that story for years. Absolutely.
Billy Wilder had
a story.
Billy Wilder had one great line he had thousands of great lines, but the one I loved was, do you know what an associate producer is? He's the only person who will associate with the producer.
I think that if Marty Scorsese or Steven Spielberg or Steve Soderbergh or whoever was sitting with us right now talking, I think they'd all agree that Billy Wilder, pound for pound, was probably the greatest film director of all time. I do think that.
Well, we should point out and give a plug to, if you said to me, what's the greatest book you ever read on show business, it wouldn't be, I don't know I hate to say what number one is because I don't know, but I put it in my magic circle. It's Conversations with Wilder by Cameron Crowe. Oh. It is extraordinary.
Great book. Read it. Yeah.
Yep.
Now, I want to mention one movie that isn't talked about. It was in the latter part of his career, but it's a very interesting film called The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. And it's one of the reasons I think the movie is fabulous. And it's interesting because the actor who stars as Sherlock Holmes was not well known at all. And I would have thought that late in Billy's career, I think he tried to get Peter O'Toole, but he couldn't get him. But Robert Stevens does a very good job, but he was definitely served by Miklos Rozsa, the great composer, who did a fabulous music score, a haunting musical score. And if you really want to enjoy a movie that was badly cut by the studio, it's called The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. It's a different side of Sherlock Holmes.
Steve, you're not the first person to mention this to me, that how terrific that movie was. Why did no one go? Why was it just nothing at the box office?
I think part of the reason may have been the casting. It was kind of an unknown cast. I think Christopher Lee has a small part as Sherlock's brother, but it was a no-name cast. I think he needed some more star power. This, I believe, was early 70s, and I think you needed a little more star power. It's kind of surprising because Billy always had a very high wattage when it came to star power.
Yeah. There's another young Sherlock Holmes, Barry Levinson, did that also didn't do business, but it's a good movie. Good movie. We haven't talked much about The Fortune Cookie, which in my opinion was half a great movie. That's my opinion, subjective. But his casting in The Fortune Cookie, the Walter Matthau role, was how great could it be? Walter Matthau in The Fortune Cookie was perfect Walter Matthau. And I think that made him a superstar, or was it Odd Couple? I think
Odd Couple.
But how about his casting in Fortune Cookie of this guy, Cliff Osmond, as, the detective or something, the private eye that was put on the case? Did you see the movie? You saw the movie, of course.
I did. Oh, yes, yeah. I did. I did want to say, though, as much as I know everyone, including me, loves Billy Wilder, we do have to point out that those last movies at the end of his life were really not anywhere near the standard
of true
what he did. One after another, he just had lost the Wilder touch, if there was such a thing.
Avante, Buddy, Fedora.
Oh, God.
Yeah, none of them worked.
Even the front page, the remake, I mean, when you think of His Girl Friday or the original front page, are terrific. And I know we're almost at the end. I just want to say about Jimmy Cagney and 1, 2, 3. These guys, Jimmy Cagney, Pat O'Brien, would be able to do 400 speeches, 400 pages in 3 minutes. If you ever watch those movies in the 30s and 40s with O'Brien and Cagney, they're just off they go with huge speeches.
Now, we should let our listeners know that if you have any questions about our show, if you have any comments about our show, we have an email. Please contact us. We'd be delighted to hear from you. It's called talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Name of our show, talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com.
What are we doing next week, Steve? What's happening next week?
Next week, we are going to have your friend Renee Taylor on, and we're going to talk about Renee's amazing career, and we're also going to have a great chat about Marilyn Monroe, who was a good friend of hers.
Oh, yeah, they studied together at the Actors Studio.
Arthur, do you have a joke for us today?
A quickie would be, in the words of King Solomon, who said to his 1,000 wives one night, "Which one of you don't have a headache tonight?" That's what he said, Steve.
Good one, Art. You and Red Buttons.
Yes. Have a good week, guys.